off or
Yeah, no, you can leave them on. Hello, everyone. Um, we have people coming in, and we're about a third of the way to the number we're supposed to have. So welcome. If you want to let us know where you're tuning in from, I know we have people from all over. So please talk in the chat. It is there for you. It is open. So if you want to tell us where you're tuning in from or what brought you here today, please put that in the chat. And I'll just go ahead and get started since we're about halfway through the number we're supposed to be at. Hi, I'm Omar Acevedo, and I'm the Literary Program Coordinator here at the Mark Twain House and Museum in Hartford, Connecticut. Thank you so much for joining us for this virtual program for Shakespeare's White Others. Virtual programs like this are produced in part with support honoring the late Frank Lord. We are happy to honor his memory with these programs. Thank you so much to our members. If you're not a member, please consider supporting our museum by becoming a member. All members receive free and or discounted admission to our author programs, the house and museum, year-round discounts in the store and cafe, and much more. You can visit our website for more information. There are many types of memberships, so they're all stated there. Now on to our guests. Our author, David Sterling Brown, is Associate Professor of English at Trinity College here in Hartford, Connecticut, and a member of the curatorial team for the Racial Imaginary Institute, founded by Claudia Rankin. He is the recipient of numerous awards, including a Mellon ACLS Scholars and Society Fellowship, and the Shakespeare Association of America's Publics Award. Our moderator, Jennifer Lynn Stoever, is Associate Professor of English at Binghamton University and founding editor-in-chief of Sounding Out. She's the author of the Sonic Color Line, Race and the Cultural Politics of Listening. She has published in numerous publications and currently has a book in progress, Living Room Revolutions, Black and Latinx Women Collecting and Selecting Records in the 1960s and 1970s. During this event, we encourage you to have a conversation with each other in the chat. If you have a question, though, please put that into the Q&A sections on the bottom left of the screen. So that's all from me for now. I'll be back later to help answer your questions. Please sit back and enjoy, and I'll turn this over to David and Jennifer.
right. Thank you
Excellent.
so much, Omar.
All right. There we go. Let me get myself on the screen. Thank you so much, Omar. Thank you to the Mark Twain House, and especially thank you to you, David, for inviting me to host this conversation today. And welcome to everyone gathered here in the virtual space to listen to our conversation and participate via the chat or the Q&A box. I'm enjoying seeing where everybody's from and why you're coming today. And I'm really excited for what's ahead in the next hour. So let's jump into Shakespeare's White Others with you, David. And I want to start with the title. It is elegantly matter of fact, and for an academic book especially, stunningly brief, like breathtakingly so. Um,
I've been, I've been hanging out with poets, so I'm like getting on my conciseness train here.
Right. And because of poets, right? Gwendolyn Brooks said poetry is life distilled. So there is so much history, revelation, and life in those three words, Shakespeare's White Others. Can you unpack those a little bit for our audience today?
Yes. So, and first of all, again, thank you, Jenny, for being here, and thanks everyone for joining us as well. I am, excited to talk about this book. Love it, the cover. We'll get into that too. But as far as Shakespeare's White Others goes, Shakespeare studies is my primary field of focus, and so I knew always that I was going to center my book on Shakespeare. But really thinking about Shakespeare and critical race studies and also critical whiteness studies was something that I knew I wanted to do too. And so when I began this project, sort of the seeds of it, maybe around 2017 or so, it came from a place of wanting to sort of sidestep the conversation that we always have about otherness, where it's just focused on people of color, Black people, Indigenous people. And so I asked my advisor, and when you actually, we had a conversation, I was like, I want other whiteness. And he was like,
Hmm.
John Archer. And he, well, if anyone can do it, maybe I think you can. And so I continued to think about that, and it became a test for me and a challenge. And when I started looking at Shakespeare's plays, I just realized that there were divisions in whiteness and within the plays and also within our world today. And so that's really where the title comes from. And again, just shifting or trying to grow out of all of the work that has been done in my field on blackness and on otherness
Mhm.
to center a conversation on whiteness, which folks are doing more and more today, which is exciting.
Excellent. Well, who or what is a white other? How would you, I think the audience today would really appreciate some more some teaching on that.
Yeah. So the white other is, in a nutshell, it's a less than ideal white figure in a play. But it also can, this happens outside of the plays too, which is something that I'm really excited about. But within the plays, we're looking at a figure like, say, Macbeth, for instance, who is someone who is a sinful character, right? He kills his king. He's also a character who is morally blackened as well. And so when we think about or when I think about the notion of the white other, I'm really interested in figures that are sort of covert tools for um, perpetuating really anti-blackness. So that's one of the things that I'm getting at with the concept of the white other is seeing how this figure, even though it is a white figure, could be Hamlet, could be Gertrude, of course, Lady Macbeth, but these are figures who, in some ways, whether it's on them in terms of their physical appearance,
Mhm. Uh-oh, we're losing you a little bit, David.
it,
Uh-oh. Hello, everyone. Just hang in there. Thank you, Larry, for that comment. I will make sure that happens. All right. Can everyone still hear me and see me? Oh, thank you. Okay, so while we are, there we go. So I was ready to come
yeah,
up with an activity. I'm glad you're back. Thank
Well,
you.
that I'm at a recording studio, so maybe that's part of the problem. So I'm going to turn this light on.
Oh
Oh,
yeah.
I don't know.
No. Recording studios are made for silence.
No.
That is what Tony Schwartz used to say, the recording artist, and that's why he actually went out into the streets and recorded because of the silencing factor of a recording studio.
But what was the last part that you got from me?
I think right after you started talking about Hamlet,
Okay.
which, mysteriously so.
It was the ghost. Ghost
Yes.
came here. No, so yeah, I was just saying how the anti-blackness within the play is and all the Shakespeare plays that I'm looking at, it's embodied in these white figures. And so when it's a play that might seem as innocent as Romeo and Juliet, it's actually happening there too, where we're seeing this anti-blackness being perpetuated and at the expense of, I would say, someone like me, for instance, while whiteness is being valorized. So this dynamic between ideal and less than ideal whiteness is really what I'm thinking about with respect to the white other formulation.
Yeah. It's funny that you mentioned Romeo and Juliet because I was walking this morning thinking about your book and how you apply this lens to Shakespeare that you can actually apply it, like you said, to every single play because it's inherent in who Shakespeare is, how he thinks, who his audience is, and the conversation in their contemporary moment that they're having, that they're working through.
Mhm.
And I was thinking about a lot of this, the white other, as you bring it up, is like it's a disciplinary function for whiteness, right? You call it white on white violence, in a great turn of phrase that's really important. And that, Romeo and Juliet, in some ways, it's like what happens to the white kids who step out of line by trying to resolve or trying to like notice that there is this to them, a very unfair situation going on that keeps them apart. So there's a disciplinary action that these plays are performing in relation to good whiteness, right?
Yes, and so what I talk about in the introduction is how, the white other functions as a mechanism that helps the policing of whiteness, actually. And it's along these lines of anti-blackness. And so even as the white other's behavior or conduct is policed, or as folks try to police it in the plays, there is a reinforcement of how what really needs to be policed in the play or also in our modern world is blackness. And so
Mhm,
that's something we get through these very subtle moments. Like Juliet has her beautiful soliloquy as far as the language is concerned and the
mhm.
construction of it, where she's sort of praising her, husband, love interest, Romeo. And a lot of the language there, though, requires her to make the composition or comparisons to blackness in order to um, amplify the beauty or the magnificence of Romeo's masculine whiteness. And so it's done at the expense of
Yeah.
blackness. And if you think about color symbolism and all of that, those two things, whether it's color symbolism or the literal sort of racial blackness, they're working together.
Yes. And in that, right, that is the formation of what you call the intraracial color line. How does thinking about the intraracial color line help us understand race in a more nuanced way today?
I was like, I should throw that question back at you since you came up with the sonic color line, but we'll talk about that.
Yes,
So,
yes.
like you and your work in the sonic color line, race and the cultural politics of listening, I am very much influenced by the work of W.E.B. Du Bois. And so I'm really fascinated with how he is using race to think about
Mm.
both the distinction between white and black in his interracial color line theory, and how, as we're thinking about the white other and these sort of white on white dynamics, there's a color line that manifests there too. And it's all dependent on, again, these notions of othering or inferior versus superior, ideal, less than ideal. And so the intraracial color line is used, like Du Bois's color line and like your sonic color line theory, to help people understand how they can identify places where the white other exists. So Macbeth, to go back to that example, he
Yes.
doesn't actually start out as a white other. It is something that happens to him in the play after his interactions with the witches, after he chooses to, you know, do harm sociopolitically. That's when he then crosses from the ideal side of the intraracial color line to the less than ideal side and becomes a white other. And so in the introduction, I say this, and I'm using the work of Bell Hooks there, as well as Toni Morrison and Arthur Little, to think about how the white other becomes. It is a figure that is both imagined, but it's also imaged too.
Yes, I think there's a great connection with the sonic color line in this idea about policing ideal whiteness and thinking about, how we are educated to both see, as you mentioned with the image, the color symbolism. And I'm going to ask you about a lot of the imagery that you explore in the book too, and how important visual imagery is to the conversation, but then
Sure.
also with sound, right? That there are certain types of sounds and mannerisms and norms that good whiteness upholds. Don't
Yeah.
be too loud, we hear, but often they're couched in these universals, actually, as Shakespeare often is, right? That's just how people should sound and how people should act. And then, things that break that sonic color line or norms that break that are seen as, too loud or a form of unseemly whiteness, right? This dangerous
Yes.
kind of fallen whiteness
Hmm.
that, undercuts the state's power, which I feel like in Macbeth, like we talked about, right? The end of the play, the horns are restored, right? The sound kind of heralds good whiteness being restored, and Shakespeare does so much of the imagery with those sounds, which, David and I, confession, we did an essay together on Macbeth that you all should really check out. And a lot of these issues we talk about our work together in the book. Um,
Yeah,
so
and when
go
you
ahead.
oh, sorry, I was just gonna say too, to add to that, when you mentioned, like good whiteness or
Yes.
the white other for me is a representation of that uncouth whiteness. And
Mhm.
so it can, and it runs along so many lines. It's not just something that is visual, like as we think about,
Yeah.
homeless clothing. It can be moral, it can be ethical, it can be really manifest in any kind of way. And that's one of the things that's so, I think, for me, interesting about race as a concept, but also whiteness, is that improvisation is incredibly important to the machinations and manifestations of whiteness, because it might need anti-blackness in this moment, but it might need something else in another moment in order to make meaning, or in order to again sustain this alleged superiority.
Yes, it pretends to a kind of perfection and a kind of logic that are constructs and absolutely break down at all kinds of moments. But then it, as you point out, in Shakespeare's works, it just
Mhm.
reconstructs itself back again, on the backs um, of the racial others and the non-white others in the book, in Shakespeare's plays. Um, so one of the main interventions of the book is right here in the title, and I love the layout of your cover. I know you work so hard
Thanks.
perfecting it with your publisher, and I realized like there's a signifying moment where, if you hold it here, right, it's the announcement, it's the pronouncement that Shakespeare's white.
Yes.
And to those of us that work in critical race theory, right, this is a, tell it, like that's the kind of moment it was for me. But to a lot of people out there, he's been thought of as ethnically and nationally and historically British. But, Shakespeare's identity, if it's talked about at all, is really couched in those terms. So what do you wish that the naming and really beginning to think about and write about, talk about, consider Shakespeare's whiteness, critique it, how will that change how we read, think about, perform, teach his works?
Yeah, that love that question, because that was something that for me with this book, I wanted to um reach as many people as I could. And we can talk about some of, or I guess I have the list in my mind of all the different subject areas that I try to
Yeah.
engage. But um my hope was that, for one, if it's theater practitioners that are engaging with this book, right, that they take the time to think about how in any play that they are performing or part of as a dramaturg or whatever it might be, directing, that they consider the role of the white other in those spaces, because it does indeed have an impact. I know this from work I've done with Keith Hamilton Cobb and the Untitled Othello project, that it has an impact on the way that we understand the plays, but also how an actor might even move their body in a particular play if they are occupying that position of the white other, or if they are in conversation with the white other, but they are themselves an ideal white figure. So that's one thing. The second would be pedagogically, just in the classroom. I've had the great privilege of doing work with Folger Education and talking to high school teachers and middle school teachers and even students, both over here, I guess, in the States, but also in the UK. And that wasn't through the Folger, but um, getting them to think about Shakespeare and race on a broader level. But more importantly, as you just said, I didn't even notice that about my own title, that the way that you just kind of chopped it off there with Shakespeare's white, like, yes, he is. And, my colleague Arthur Little, he just published earlier this year, White People in Shakespeare. And so I think we're in this moment where people are really trying to actively, conscientiously, daily do the work of naming whiteness and of course naming Shakespeare's whiteness. And that's why I start the book the way that I do. Because that question, I believe, from Du Bois, how does it feel to be a problem? I reframe that in the introduction, having this imagined conversation with Shakespeare. How does it feel to be a white problem? Because the problem is often the other with the capital O, as in the black person or the Latino person. But if anybody's raced, and we all are, if anybody's racialized, then there's always potential to be the problem. So that's something else I wanted people to think about. And then just trying to write in such a way that allows, again, as I said, a broader audience to engage with the book. So not just people who are academics, but even people who aren't, people who maybe think they don't even like to read. I always tell them that's because you haven't read the right book. Read read this one. And
Yeah.
so those are some things I wish for people.
It it's funny that you mentioned the beginning of the book, which is really powerful. And I
Thank you.
think another point of entry that is key, and it's ironic that the one of the a key point of entry to your book is actually the ending. And in that, I was really reminded, we talked about Du Bois, but there is also a conversation, I think, with Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man going on
Mhm.
here, especially with, relating to Keith Hamilton Cobb and the hear me, see me. So when I got to the end of your book, it reminded me of Invisible Man, where the narrator says at the beginning, right? The end is in the beginning and it lies far ahead. And I felt like the end of your book is in the beginning of your book and vice versa. And can you talk a little bit about the ending of your book? No spoilers, audience, but this is really important. You might even want to read it first,
Yeah.
especially as you dedicate your book to your vulnerable teenage self. What was the decision like to end the book this way and close with that and with the letter that your teenage self wrote in
Yeah.
2002, I believe, right?
Yeah, so that's another great question for me. The end was the beginning, and that's when I really, I mean, folks don't know this, but I'll say this, unless they're coming from places where I've tweeted this or on Facebook, but Jennifer was a part of a book manuscript workshop that I did in 2020, and I was, working on the book then, and certainly changed throughout the years before I published it, but I ended with this letter that I wrote in 2002 after being racially profiled in my hometown in Norwalk, Connecticut. I was stopped 4 times by 3 different police officers over a 6 month period. So, and this started in December of 2001, actually, when I was 17. And so, um, that had all my parents still live in the same house. So, this had always been something that was hard to get away from because there's constant, the body keeps score is the name of this book on trauma, and certainly does. But of course, if you deal and heal, as I say about my vulnerable teenage self in the dedication, it's possible to transform these moments into something else, maybe even something positive. And so I put the letter at the end of the book to honor that 18-year-old self who only thing I knew to do at the time was write, because I certainly knew I couldn't talk back to the police because that would not end well. Um, and I used it though as the impetus for the book and thinking about, okay, if I want to end the book in this way, how do I get here through Shakespeare? And so that's why I love that you got a sort of Ellison vibe from the conclusion and what leads up to it. But also, I think speaking of Ellison, I'm really using the conclusion in chapter 4 to talk loudly in the sort of Amiri Baraka sense, the Black art poem, but also to speak on the lower frequencies.
Yes.
So for people who maybe been through stuff or know this, there's a message there for them too.
We've talked about now Ralph Ellison. We've talked about Toni Morrison. I believe you brought Morrison up, but I know she's a big influence on your book. Amiri Baraka. There's so much of this book that is a Black studies book. W.B. Du Bois, Claudia Rankine, and Black studies is one of the many fields that you talk to and bring together in Shakespeare's White Others, which to many people might be unexpected in terms of Shakespeare. Can you talk about that and share just how interdisciplinary this book is and why it's important for this kind of work to speak to that many areas?
Yeah, so I have always been a strong advocate for not having things siloed. So,
Mm.
like, if anyone goes to my website, pretty much anything I've written, they can have access to. Um, I like to talk to other scholars, but I also like to just talk to everyday folks on the street. I mean, that's how I grew up. In my neighborhood, it was a sense of community, and so with the book, I'm both trying to build community for both myself, but also for other scholars. Like when I talked to Kufu Zubiri at the ACLS conference 2 years ago, he's a prolific race scholar, sociologist. He had no idea either about how Shakespeare and race are integrated in conversations. And so it was like, okay, like there's this major sociologist out there doing this work on blackness, black studies, but also on critical whiteness studies, and is not engaging with work from my field when he could be, because we're certainly engaging with that work. How do we fix that? And so the interdisciplinary focus of the book was really about problem solving, one, but also trying to reach people who maybe they're afraid of Shakespeare, maybe they're, not interested in Shakespeare, but they're interested in mental health, or they're interested in
Mm.
sociology, or they're interested in work like yours, which is sound studies. So I thought, again, bringing as much as I could and all things that interest me. So I can just run down a list in my head really quick.
Yeah,
Critical
go
white
for it.
critical whiteness studies, social psychology, sociology, mental health, black feminism, black male studies. It's a little bit of queer studies in there as well as sexuality. Of course, Shakespeare studies, sound studies, and even visual art is a part of the book. And maybe we could talk about that too. But if someone sees the Macbeth image or the Hamlet image, or there's a lynching photo that I have in the book as well, and that becomes their into the book, that's great. And so, in addition to how I wrote the book, in terms of it being accessible for the average reader, I also wanted it to be accessible for people outside of my field. And part of that was, I won't say a requirement, but because Cambridge awarded my book their academic impact designation, which means it received, special marketing attention, but also it was designed to be written for a broader audience. That meant I had work to do to sort of bring my other interests in, which I actually found to be quite fun.
That is congratulations on that award and especially for recognition for something for a path that I think you were have been a leader in your field and in bringing not just bringing a wider audience for your work but really one of the other subjects that you engage in is right hood pedagogy. You bring in Mickey Kendall's work
Yeah.
and really think about you know think about analysis as holistic, as calling on all of these tools, and that is a really important part of your toolkit that provides important knowledge in this book, right? That moment where you put Hamlet side by side with Tupac,
Yeah.
well, in a way that just kind of like Hamlet doesn't get, doesn't Hamlet doesn't catch cases, as you mentioned, where everyone
Yeah.
where Aaron does, you
Yes.
know, Black writing and thought, right? The literary inventiveness, the inventiveness with words is something that Shakespeare gets credit for, right? And Black students in our schools get denigrated for. And I think that moment, that Hamlet Tupac moment is just brilliant in pointing that out.
Well, thank you. And so you also reminded me here that music is
Yes.
there's music in the book. In a way, I begin with an Sam Snead song that I have a quotation from. You better recognize. And in the book, thinking about Tupac, but Michael Jackson's Black or White is in the introduction and returns later in the book because, that song, 1991, I believe it was, Black or White, it was such a huge, huge moment. And I remember when I was working on this book, walking one day, and that song just entered my mind. And I'm like, wait a minute, it absolutely does matter if you're black or white. And it also matters if you occupy the space of the white other, too. So, yeah, thank you for referencing. The music and in an art gallery, a virtual reality art gallery that I created, there's also music in there from Pulitzer Prize winning composer Anthony Davis.
And you are also doing some new sound work for the book, correct?
Yes, I am doing some new sound work. So I'm just gonna pan over there for a second. I'm actually in New York right now at Tantor Studios, and so I'm doing an audiobook for Shakespeare's White Others, which I'm very excited about. And I've been working on that. Got here yesterday, and this is all for me. One, certainly a dream come true to have the opportunity to record in my voice. I'm narrating it, so it can exist in perpetuity, but not just, I always think about my family and like, what am I going to leave behind? And so that's why my website looks the way it does, because we lose a lot of history in at least my family, but I know a lot of Black families. And what else could I do? And so I was able to get this contract to do the audiobook. But for me, it's also about accessibility. There are people who can certainly maybe stand to hear my words, but maybe reading is harder, or maybe affording a book that's $40 is a barrier. When in fact something like an audiobook, will likely be cheaper, but it also gives people an opportunity to really sit with the words. So that's one of the things I'm really excited about. Yes, the audiobook is coming.
Yes, and also an opportunity to add an extra, I think, or add a layer of meaning to the book through
Hmm.
voice and performance, right? Which is part of how Shakespeare's plays operate. They're not just words on a page, and why they're so vivid to so many is that performance aspect. And I think it's really fitting that you are also doing a
Yes.
performance element to your book.
Yeah, I didn't ever think about it that way, but you're absolutely right. Because as I'm sitting here in the booth, I'm having to stop at moments where I feel like I haven't read something in the way that I want it to sound for a reader, or having to take on the voices of different Shakespeare characters, and not pretending to be, like playing a woman's voice or anything like that, but adding something to the way that I speak it. And then also the opportunity to read the letter that we were just talking about. I couldn't see anybody else doing that but me, because this book is very personal as well as critical and experiential. And so the opportunity to perform, I would say, um, is such a blessing. Yeah.
Yes, and the way that you'll be modeling an ethical performance, just is exactly as you said, like so much of some the stereotype work in Shakespeare does happen through sound, through accent, through tone, and in your reading of it, that'll be part of the gift of the book too, is modeling that as you read, which is really important.
Thanks.
I know
Yeah.
when Shakespeare in high school, we read it aloud together, and that's an experience that many people have. So hearing your voice doing it, I think um, will be really really exciting, and will really make like it'll enact what's going on, what you're arguing will be enacted in how you perform it. Um, will there be parts you think that are
Do that
difficult
too.
to record in the audiobook? And were there parts of the book that were difficult to write? What was that experience like?
Man, so the hardest part, I'm just gonna try to open this door and see if that helps. The hardest part of recording yesterday was actually the acknowledgments.
Mm,
Um, my acknowledgments section is quite long and extensive. There are a number of people, probably over 100 people, that I thank in the acknowledgments. And while it was such a privileged again to have the opportunity to say all of those names and give the credit. It was really hard for me to read because it doesn't flow like the writing that I do in the chapters. So that was challenging. And I think also, we haven't gotten there yet, but I'm imagining chapter four, Hear Me, See Me, Sex, Violence, Silence, and Othello is going to be challenging because it was also the hardest chapter for me to write. It is my favorite chapter, but it is the most personal, I would say, beyond the letter and the conclusion. And having to deal with things in that chapter, such as like generational trauma, in between the lines in this book, there's a lot that I am, I guess, signaling as far as experience and life experience is concerned. So people who know me will read moments and obviously be able to see that I'm saying something without saying it.
Mhm.
Um, and I think that's one of the beauties of chapter four, but also one of the things that's going to make it hard because I'm going to have to, once again, as I was, doing like the editing process with this book or proofreading, have to sort of go through that. But it's been fun so far, I will say, recording. But yeah, the acknowledgement section, really hard.
Yes. When I got to chapter four, the first, the opening of the book, the other three chapters, there's just this sense of like, yes, like you are pointing out the relevance, the deep relevance of Shakespeare to the contemporary moment in ways that most people don't think about. When I got to chapter four, I'm like, oh, this is the urgency of Shakespeare and how Shakespeare works that most people don't know about. Um, you know, what makes Shakespeare urgent? How does this book offer readers a way of understanding how race structures our contemporary moment and some of the, the issues of our current time?
Yeah, so I'm gonna answer that question through chapter four.
Yes.
It's a chapter that deals with um, sexual violence, and so this is a book that engages sexual violence, engages mental health, and both in thinking about men and women, but in particularly Black men and women. But chapter four uses, well, the whole book really, Shakespeare I see is the vehicle that helps me carry these messages forward. And so when I think about the sense of urgency of what is happening in our world right now, it doesn't so much for me revolve around Shakespeare, although I'm so grateful that Shakespeare's plays are so rich that they enable me to have these different conversations. But I believe that we could have these conversations about any text or TV show or film. And so just using the book really to raise awareness about particular issues is something that I am doing. So, in addition to being aware of sexual violence against men, I also want people to be aware of how certain people's voices are not heard. And that's where your work, the Sonic Color Line, comes in, or they are heard differently, or they are heard less and devalued. And I think we certainly can see that sometimes with the white other. Um, but in that chapter, I talk about how there were antebellum um, or postbellum abolitionists who were actually violators sexually of Black men, for instance, and women, of course. And I link that to a conversation that I raised about Jerry Sandusky and that Penn State scandal that we had with the abuse of young, boys then too. And so, really, just trying to help people again, like the sort of subjects that I cover, subject areas, help people find their way into this text through a conversation that matters to them. And so when I think back to graduate school and the who are you in conversation with, um, I think my answer then was probably like everybody, even though that was such a naive response. But right now, I'd say I am with this book trying to be in conversation with as many people as I can be in conversation with. And so I constantly am surprised when I'm experiencing something out in the world and I'm like, oh, I actually talk about that in the book, like gun violence, for instance. That's something that is in this Shakespeare book, as well as addiction is in this Shakespeare book. as well as gang violence is in this Shakespeare book. So there's a lot that people can get exposed to through a read of Shakespeare's White Others.
Yes, and the conversations that extend from that, and can extend from that is, they do feel really limitless. And your book offers, a breaking of the sonic color line, looking back at Shakespeare and going, I think you actually maybe say this at some point. You can help me, remember the exact language, but it's like he was not capable of expressing these characters, Black characters, in a kind of depth and realness. Let
Hmm.
me strip back all of these kind of layers of silencing, of the idea of, right, good whiteness, of who is to be believed, who's to be listened to.
Yes.
Let me strip that out, and so we can hear and see, a character like Aaron, a character like Othello,
Hmm.
in very different ways. And that absolutely applies, as you said, to thinking about something, like what happened to the survivors of Jerry Sandusky, and in our daily lives.
Yeah, and when I think back to Morrison's work, so I use the origin of others, but then also that I think it was the conversation she had with Charlie Rose, where she's talking about white people and anti-black racism, and ask the question, you know, like what happens if you take me out of it, you know, and so that really was the impetus for what I did in my chapter, the first chapter on Titus. Um, I asked that question, like, what is Titus Andronicus without Aaron? And I look at the play, taking because he's one character out of many, and if we just take him out of it, which I don't even really have to do that because he doesn't say anything in the whole first act. And so Shakespeare takes him out of it too for a moment.
Mhm.
Um, but what is there? And when we stop being distracted by the emphasis on the other, capital O, and look at what is happening in these white on white dynamics, we see things like white on white crime, for instance. We see the devaluation of white life among white people. And that was really fascinating to me because for a long time, and if you look at Shakespeare scholarship on Titus, a lot of it focuses on Aaron and his blackness, especially past scholarship, in like the 90s and the early 2000s. And it's like, yeah, but there's so much more that could be said here about race beyond Aaron.
Right. And it also reminded me of Fred Moten going, I'm not responsible for Othello. I'm not, like, Shakespeare's responsible for Othello. And I feel that very much in your work too. Um,
Oh,
and
thanks.
yeah, that was very powerful. Oh my goodness. Well, I guess, you want to speak to the people and to speak to as wide of an audience as possible. And I'm looking at the time and I'm thinking that this is, it's time to open it up to the audience, because I have so many more questions. I could talk
Okay.
to you all day about your work. And one thing we didn't talk about is the role of white women in this, implicated in this process too, as the kind of feigned innocence and handmaiden to a lot of whiteness in the book, and producing whiteness. So maybe that's something we can talk about in the Q&A.
Yeah.
Right.
And definitely there, chapters 2 and 3. Take that on.
Yeah, I'm not seeing any questions right now. So maybe if you all want to move on to another topic of conversation while people are formulating their thoughts, and we
Sure.
can come back to the questions.
Yeah.
Right.
One I was gonna mention was about the virtual art gallery.
Yes, yes, because the visuals are so important to the argument in your book, and you really make it come alive there. And then Todd Barnes does want to hear more about the role of white women in this process, and sexuality and gender.
Okay. Well, yes, we could definitely go there. I'm going to just put in the chat really quickly, and I will definitely answer Todd's question, or we can have that conversation. But I wanted to put a link to and just tell everybody about this. Um, because we talked about visuals and accessibility, and so something I created, I worked on for 2 years, so started in 2021, was a virtual reality art gallery that's a visual complement to the book. So like Beyonce had to drop the visuals for Shakespeare's White Others. And it is it's pretty neat. You don't need virtual reality goggles to access it, but I put the link in the chat. Folks can check it out. You can just use if you're on a computer, you can use your arrow keys and trackpad or your mouse, or you can also use a tablet. And I believe you can access it through cell phone. But I have 39 pieces of art from the Folger Shakespeare Library there that allow readers to orient themselves into seeing what this white other looks like in art. And so Macbeth is an anchor image there, and it's one I have in the book. But also, there are art analyses done by my Trinity College students from last term that help people if they happen to be afraid, like because they don't think they are art analysis capable, which I think anybody is.
Mhm.
You can see the videos of my students in the fifth room in the gallery. And then I also have a piece there on Tucker Carlson, and that's posted on Claudia Rankine's Racial Imaginary Institute website, where I'm showing people how, again, the figure of the white other and the concept of the interracial color line apply outside of Shakespeare's works and within our real world. So just wanted to mention that and hope people will check that out. But more about the role of white women. Um, where to begin, Jenny?
Lady Macbeth is always a great one, I think.
Yes. Yeah, that's a good one actually, because I think it's chapter one, even though it's on Titus, I think I begin that chapter with an analysis of Macbeth. And when we look at Lady Macbeth and Macbeth's relationship, she certainly influences a lot of his choices, as do the witches. And so there's commentary there
Yeah.
on this sort of um, I don't know, darkness of femininity, if you will, and I should say white femininity in particular, because Lady Macbeth she does not embody the conventional qualities that one expects of like a dutiful white early modern wife or early modern woman in that respect. She's got masculine qualities, for instance, which contribute to her being represented as a white other, but her sort of collaborative violation of domestic decorum with her husband also puts her in that category. But white women, I would say, are oftentimes positioned, and we see this in the plays, as scapegoats that actually help aid and sustain white patriarchal power. And it's not always clear, I think, even to them sometimes, that
Yeah.
that is what is happening. But it is happening. And it is one of the reasons why I see, and I think I say this in the introduction, when we think about white women and white men, the relationships, and procreatively speaking, they have a huge responsibility to help sustain whiteness. And so even that speaks to, on some level, the call it unwitting complicity, if you will, because sometimes they're in these positions where they are actually knowingly, like I can think back to I forget what the percentage of white women that it was that voted for Trump, for instance.
Right, right. 60%, I believe, maybe
Something
even
that
more
was
than that. Might be
something
75.
something crazy high. And
Yes.
people were like shocked. And then people who were sort of in the know, as we're talking about the role of white women, were not so shocked because of, again, that allegiance to both whiteness, but also white patriarchy. And I don't know if
Yes.
you want to add anything, Jenny, because this is your wheelhouse too.
Right, I know. I was thinking about that, and I was thinking about in the Sonic Color Line, the chapter on Richard Wright, and thinking about Native Son, which I saw actually I saw, and I'm sure that Wright in his genius is making reference in some ways to Othello with Bigger Thomas, the character in Native Son. Because thinking about the scream and the power of the white woman's scream in terms of danger to black men and the use of that and the manipulation of that by white patriarchy as an excuse to engage in sexual violence of black men, but also the way that white women know this and can wield this power, like we saw that happen to, the woman with Christian Cooper in
Oh yeah,
the
in the New York City Central Park
yes,
situation. Yeah,
yes, Amy Cooper, the bird
Amy
wa
Cooper.
the
Yeah.
bird, yes, she had her dog in the bird watcher, right? We see her use or kind of enact potential racial violence
Mhm.
in the name of gender protection. And I think you see this and you tease that out happening in Shakespeare's moment too.
Yeah, there's a great former colleague of mine, and I'm trying to find the exact quote because I want to say it from memory, but Susan Brianti, she is a poet, and she has a great sort of quotation that I borrow from in my book, where she talks about how whiteness is a construct of convenience and improvisation. And
Mhm.
so that Amy Cooper moment that you just brought up is is improvisation. Like, I mean, give that woman an Oscar because the performance there in terms of trying to both play the helpless victim role, but also, I mean, she was doing a lot of work, but we could spend an hour talking about that. But tapping into, again, these anti-Black stereotypes about Black men, which I talk about in the book as well, all of that work is doing key harm, but all in the name of, again, preserving this idea that she's innocent, she's victim,
Yeah.
because she knows how believable that is to certain audiences, just the notion of white woman in danger, and how that improv act could, in that moment, um, potentially endanger, as you said, this Black man's life.
Yes, and she enacts it in a way, in a learned way, like the kind of good whiteness that will be listened to.
Mhm.
It's the same sense, if listening to the tape of George Zimmerman when he calls up the neighborhood watch and the tone of voice that he speaks in of the good white citizen calling the police, that he expects to be heard and he expects to be believed. And, that is that moment of, right, the separation between, the both the other who is not heard and not believed, or the interracial other, as you mentioned, as the a kind of irredeemable whiteness, right? They know how to enact that with their voices, that sound of good whiteness, and they show the utility of doing that,
Yep.
and the kind of danger and violence that's behind it.
And I'm sorry, folks, I'm just like throwing so much into the chat, but as we're talking about this, Situation 11 is actually a short video that Claudia Rankin and her husband John Lucas put together about the Central Park incident with Amy Cooper and Christian Cooper. And so, if folks want to check that out, it essentially amplifies everything that Jenny was just saying about how the voice is used. Claudia really breaks that down in the video.
Oh, that's great. Here we got a question. This has been such a terrific event. Thank you, Todd. This framing may be reductive, but I'm curious. Does your project see the plays as policing whiteness, representing the policing of whiteness, and posing it as a problem, and or both?
Great question. So definitely see the plays as policing whiteness. I mean, that's the whole impetus behind the role of the white other. So when I look at I don't know, Hamlet, for instance, or yeah, we can look at Hamlet. Um, Hamlet and pretty much all the male characters in that play, as well as the female characters, the women characters, are representations of the white other. That's a play that is bookended in the first act and the last by representations of ideal majestic white masculinity. So thinking about old Hamlet, the deceased king, and then young Fortinbras, who comes in at the end of the play. So for me, I would say it's less of representing the policing of whiteness as opposed to actually seeing it explicitly happening. But to the second part of that question, definitely is a problem. Because if the policing of whiteness is dependent upon the sort of imagined blackness that these characters embody, then what does that mean for somebody like me, for instance, who really does, at least by society's sort of optic standards, um, embody, carry, represent, exude blackness, right? So that means that not only are the white others being policed, but that policing is almost like training for the actual policing of people like me.
Oh, thank you. Todd says thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I love that question.
In thinking about that question, it was reminding me of like in Shakespeare, a lot of and power and authority, and the way that in a lot of the resolutions, it's actually like a reaffirmation of state power, that there's a good kind of violence and there's a bad kind of violence, or the bad violence is often this kind of upstart whiteness trying to challenge, say like Macbeth and Lady Macbeth, right? That is the kind of violence that will not be tolerated, that's out of step with this idea of I guess the white elites in charge that have been, that is the passing on of in these plays.
Yeah, and then we get to the end of that play, and I think you and I talk about this in our article. And in order to purge, the Scottish landscape of Macbeth, we need violence to do that, right? And
Yeah.
so you're absolutely right that there's this sanctioning of a sort of bad kind of violence and also a good kind, and it's contingent upon, again, these different scenarios that are a matter of convenience and improvisation.
Yes, I'm very connected to the beginning of the colonial era.
Absolutely. Oh, and I forgot that colonialism, something else I talk about in the book. Like,
Yes.
you should just make a list of what I don't talk about in the book. That might be easier.
To be sure. Omar, I believe Omar has some last words for us. Thank you, David, for a great conversation and
Yeah,
for
thank you, Jenny, and thanks everyone for being
a
here.
great read, please.
Yeah, thank you so much, David, for this amazing book, and thank you, Jennifer, for joining us for this discussion. This is really amazing, and thanks to everyone in our audience as well for joining us. This webinar has been recorded and will be available later this afternoon.
Oh, awesome.
Yeah, that is all for from us.
Sorry for my little dropout there earlier in the conversation. Was trying to find good Wi-Fi spot. So
Yeah, it's
Yes, and
totally
sorry
okay.
for my lighting that is enacting some of these Renaissance images. Sun is not usually a problem in upstate New York, but I try my best.
yeah, thank you everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good afternoon. Have a good day.
Thanks.